congratulations on making it, and I hope you survive. Anyway, let's start. My work has often been discussed in terms of Henri Bergson's ideas of duration and the composite. In this talk, perhaps unfortunately or fortunately, you will come to understand duration, not theoretically, but experientially. So prepare yourself. I enjoy rambling. One of my favourite speakers is the Dutch architect Lars Spoybroek. He often runs out of time during his lectures. I model my talks on this principle. Slow to start, run out of time, abrupt to finish. So let's bang on. This talk is about my reflections on the Gutai, Manohar and Dansequai art movements and on contemporary monochrome painting, including a little bit of my own practice just to demonstrate my position, prejudices, if you like, and on something and nothing. In doing so, I will continue the tradition at JAHM of talking about nothing. Interaction between East and West has rarely been simple, and it has never been one-directional. It is one of exchange, mutual influence, misunderstanding at times, and complexity. Interaction, to paraphrase Homi Bhabha's definition of translation, is a movement of meanings. We are based in Australia, a country placed between Eastern, Western, Indigenous and settler cultures. As a result, our culture is wobbly, to use an academic term. It is wobbly in particular and unique ways. It is evolving and dynamic. It is not fixed, and its wobbliness has both its strength and weakness. All cultures have a bit of this, but in different ways. Wobbliness, change, or impermanence are the conditions in which we live. My practice as an artist, curator, and academic has taken me across the globe, from the Pacific to Europe, from Asia to North America. I have been deeply engaged in art and art education in all these places. Therefore, I am in a position to make relatively informed, but not necessarily accurate, comments on contemporary practice. I am an artist, and I am not a specialist historian. So this talk is personal, a bit bio, a bit academic. It derives from wanting to share what I have learned and what I am curious about. Hopefully it will be of interest to you. My curiosity has led me to meet people and engage in ideas and experiences that as a young artist I would never have guessed at, things that I never knew existed. And I say this to encourage you who are new to art to follow your questions. Don't worry if you don't know. We're all always in this boat of not knowing things. We just sit in different seats. So enjoy the journey. No one else can do it for you. I sometimes write one-liners for my students. Here's a one-liner. When you look at art, you see your own understandings. You don't necessarily see what the art is concerned with. This is particularly relevant when discussing art from different cultures. We grow from what we know. Art, like life, is too complex an activity to fully grasp. Like the ideas we form, we are impermanent, existing amid a greater cosmos or mystery than we can ever totally understand. Despite this, I will make two observations about contemporary painting. The first is its acceptance of complexity, and the second is its engagement with and awareness of time. Contemporary art, like life, exists as a multiplicity where things are different in kind and they coexist in composite relationships. This perhaps explains the use of flexible, diverse, even paradoxical codes and techniques currently coexist in our contemporary visual language. And it is amid this complexity that the apparent simplicity of the monochrome exists. The multiplicity of contemporary art manifests the reality of the movement between local and global cultures. It also recognises that the human issues and questions that we all have in common can be explored in diverse ways, reflecting the diversity of local conditions amid global concerns. Over time, we realise that there is no singular style, ideology, or simple solution to our situations and questions. We must exist in a healthy ecology of diversity and hopefully of tolerance, and we certainly need this today. My second point is that our perceptions and our culture operate in time. Contemporary art helps us to understand temporality. Times, events external to us change and occur in relationship to our individual ongoing lived time, the time of perception, feeling and memory. The pulse between these orders of time, external and internal, affect our understanding and our consciousness of things. The inconsistencies and paradoxes between our understandings and reality can engender energy, curiosity, generating questions that enable new potentials to be investigated and to reconcile complexity and paradox. Even our misunderstandings can be useful occasionally. My understandings have certainly helped my art to develop, or misunderstandings, I should say. Like life, artworks have multiple layers of content, and we as viewers need time to unpack them. Henri Bergson wrote, "Perception is the object of our perception minus everything that does not interest us." In this talk, the object of my perception and my interest is the monochrome. I believe the monochrome is a useful genre through which to consider complexity, time, perception, something, and emptiness. This is a mural on the side of a Buddhist temple in Gyeonggi-do, Korea. It's about 2.5 metres high and about 5 metres long, approximately. It could have been made centuries ago or yesterday. These murals sometimes have narratives painted on them. At other times they are left blank. I don't know if they are finished, which in itself is an important metaphor of ongoing potentiality. To me, they provide a beautiful example of the monochrome. I love the way the empty pictorial space is framed. As a result, my readings shift from a perceived coloured painted surface or wall to a pictorial space where there is a sense of atmosphere, a space of infinity, of emptiness, or in Buddhist terminology, sunyata. Sunyata alludes to no mind, a loss of the ego in order to perceive the actual, the nature of being. The concept of emptiness, in my understanding, has nothing to do with nihilism. It is a generative emptiness that connects one with the life force, the energy of chi, that is manifest in nature and culture. It helps us to consider impermanence and change. Again, as Henri Bergson says, there do not exist things made, but only things in the making, not states that remain fixed amid nature, not states that remain fixed, but states in the process of change, or as I say, everything is becoming. The idea of being amid nature, amid a bigger reality than ourselves, is critical in understanding the art we will consider tonight. The understanding of emptiness, the loss of self, is common to many mystical traditions, Fana in Islam, or the kenotic tradition in Christianity, or as we heard last lecture on the Jewish traditions of emptiness and of nothing. In Northeast Asia, the dynamic concepts of yin and yang, positive and negative, full and empty, inform pictorial, philosophical, contemplative traditions, particularly in Chan or Zen Buddhism. They underlie many post-war practices. Emptiness, if you like, is part of a process, not an end. Sunyata is experienced. It is not adequately described in words, which makes this talk problematic. Emptiness is part of an ongoing process, not an end, where things are observed, coming and going in and out of consciousness until differences, paradoxes are reconciled. For me, the monochrome functions like emptiness, as an interval or a gap, or ma, as the Japanese say, that enables us to be aware of what is, what surrounds it, and how we construct meaning. I will talk about Murakami, not this Murakami, but this Murakami. Murakami was a member of the Gutai group in Japan, and this group operated in the 1950s and 60s. Again, just before we go into any real detail, we'll talk about Gutai in more detail later, but it's important to consider the period of time, the history in which these sorts of works were made. This was made in the early 50s or mid-50s, only 10 years after Hiroshima, with the reconstruction of Japan and the investigation, the attempt to create new art for a new time. I'll also talk about Monoha movement. This is a work by Li Yufan called Drolatum. And I'll discuss the Dansei Kwa movement, which is a monochrome movement in Korea that again developed in the 1970s and 80s. This work by Park Se-bong. And very briefly at the end I'll talk about this work of the Tashima Art Museum by Ryu Nishizawa and Rai Naito. So I'm going to give you a short and ridiculously inaccurate version of Western monochrome. I'll just read this essay from 1988 by Thomas McEverley, who used to be the editor of Art Forum, and it's called Seeking the Primal Through Art, a Monochrome Icon. And it places the monochrome in a modernist Western tradition. The monochrome painting is the most mysterious icon of modern art. A rectangle of single colour, more or less unmodulated, is erected on the wall at eye level and gazed at by humans in referential silence. What is happening? The painting is not impressing the viewer through a display of skill. In it, skill is negated, draftsmanship is negated, compositional sense is negated, colour manipulation and relationship are negated. Subject matter, drama, narrative, painterly presence, touch are absent. The colour may have been applied with a roller or a spray gun. It may even be the natural colour of unpainted fabric. One might as well be looking at the wall the picture is mounted on. Yet here in this ritual pictorial moment, the deepest meanings of Western modernist art are embedded, its highest spiritual aspirations, its dream of a utopian future, its madness, its folly. And he concludes his essay by saying, as an element of design, it may live past the end of the century, but as a major conquest it lies in the past, exhausted and wrung dry of meaning. It is a banner of the mad ambition of modernist abstraction. This is a lively and intelligent essay. He's a really good writer who often writes on Eastern art as well. But I argue against his reading here and claim that the monochrome, in its recent manifestations, is much more than an endgame of modernism. This is because the monochrome exists not simply as a reductive object or iconoclastic image, but as a phenomenological and temporal signifier amid the world, an interval in the continuum of time and space. The contemporary monochrome is global, and the global is made up of local contexts and cultures. The Western monochrome started probably in 1845, I think, by a Frenchman called Jean-Louis Petit, who made a black painting with little white dots on it. And it was a satirical comment on the paintings of Whistler. Later on in the 1880s, this group of people called the Incoherents had a magazine. They were a proto-data type of group. And they made a whole range of different monochromes. And again, a critique of the simplifications that were happening in advanced art of such as Impressionism. So each of these printed panels had a title. So the red one, for example, we won't go through all of them, but it translates as apoplectic, a volley of tomatoes thrown by apoplectic cardinals on the shores of the Red Sea. So you can see from this that there was a certain satirical foundation for Western modernist monochromes. Later on, Rodchenko, as part of the constructivist movement, defined this as the end of painting, and it was called pure red, pure yellow and pure blue. The constructivists were part of a revolutionary movement in art at the beginning of the 20th century to try to make new art for a new age. They emphasised the materiality and the process of working. They were particularly anti-metaphysical. More metaphysical were the suprematists whose leader was Malevich, who did this work called the Black Square. He did many variations of this, and often they were placed in situ in some of his exhibitions where the traditional Russian icon would be placed. And in some ways the black is a symbol for containing everything, of the void, of what we don't understand but feel. This is my response to that. It's called A Surprise for Malevich, and it's a work in the Heidi collection. And it's both a bad sense of humour, but also slightly serious. It deals with time in several ways. It deals with the time of the photograph, the time of printing, the time of painting, and the time of its installation. It is behind glass, so the black acts as a mirror, reflecting the viewer seeing themselves viewing. This is a clearer photo of a similar work called A Mid-History in the National Gallery of Victoria. And again, it starts off with a very simple premise of a photographic moment of a tourist shot superimposed with the black reflection painting which contains dust, again metaphors of time, and the viewer being reflected in it. It also is placed in such a way where it frames what is happening within the picture. It helps you being placed amid the observation of what's going on in the periphery of your vision. So I was interested in this idea of how monochromes and colour work in context and how the pictorial exists in the world. And this work of 2004 was called The Duration of Light. And it consisted of a large black monochrome painted on the exterior of a window that would create a mirror-like form in the inside, and monochromes that referenced the difference between the greys and the greens of painting and the greys and the greens of the exterior. So they're constructed in a sense as contemplations, and contemplations of what we're actually looking at and the relationship of art to the world, to amid the world. And so there's no surprise when I came across this work in 2007, which was made by Tanaka Atsuko. She originally made this work in 1955. And again, when we think of this work, it could be made yesterday. It's a work that, I'll just read this briefly. She was a member of the Gutai movement, and this is exhibited at Castle and Documenta in 2007. It was originally made in 1955, made of silk and sticks. It's about 10 metres by 10 metres. And it's supported by 20 centimetres off the ground on sticks. The horizontal monochrome responds to the natural phenomena of wind and rain and light. It reflects light and colour. In its passivity, it activates our recognition of change in the surrounding world. Its bright pink colour fills one's field of vision, saturating the eye and in turn affects the way we see the surrounding world. When we look away, the greens of the grass are intensified as a luminous afterimage. This monochrome is not simply an endpoint to modernism, a la Greenberg's colour field formalism. Rather, it is an immersive work placed in situ amid the world, not as a signifier of essence or reductive purity, but in its blank richness. It activates one's awareness of perceiving in time and space. Colour acts as a movement in time. Colour becomes. The work, when viewed through the filter of the monochrome tradition, expands our understanding of the monochrome and has implications for practice today. The work does not represent anything other than what it is. But what it is a complexity, including being a field for our own projections. It is materially different from so much Western art of its time. Compare it to abstract expressionism, art informel or matter painting of the 1950s in the West. Tanaka's piece is transient, mobile, transportable and fragile. It locates itself and us as viewers amid both the worlds of nature and of culture. And this is really important to think of. The work that we're looking at in Asia always has this concept of being amid nature. It is amid the world of external shifting phenomena and the internal worlds of our own perception, sensation and meaning. I became interested in this sort of stuff around 1975. I looked like that. That was me. And I was in London, and I lied my way into the British reading room because I wanted to read this guy's work. This guy was called Ellie Ford. He wrote the first, I think it was an 8-volume history of art that included Oriental art, Oceanic art, art from South America, art from Japan, China, as well as the Western canon from classical Greek art through to the decadent art of Bonnard in the late 19th century. He wrote a lot of this stuff when he was a doctor, and he wrote a lot of this stuff in the trenches in the First World War. The books are still in print in French. Oops, I've just pressed the wrong thing. What's happened? Oh. When I got tired of reading this book, I went upstairs, and upstairs in the British Museum there was an exhibition called on Southern Song painting, classical painting from the Song dynasty of Chinese painting on silk. And it was fascinating. It seemed to talk to me about these ideas of fullness and emptiness, and about the way that we might engage with a contemplative practice. And so when you leave the British Museum in those days, you could walk across the road and there was this bookshop of Oriental art books. So I bought this book. I didn't realise that Oswald Siren, who wrote it, was one of the leading experts on Chinese painting. And in this book there's a list of terms, and the first two principles are called Qi and Yung. And Qi Yung, when combined together, translate roughly as spirit resonance. No one really knows what all that means, apart from it's a type of energy. And this has been debated in Chinese aesthetics for centuries. But what it leads to is, after that, are the principles of Qi Yung, which are the manifestations of this in aesthetics and in visual art. As well as painting, it includes calligraphy and other things. These principles underlie a lot of contemporary art, as well as the reactions to these principles that occur in contemporary art in Asia, in Northeast Asia. One of the other things that I've been very lucky in my life to do is to teach at RMIT. And one of the things about RMIT, like most Australian universities, that they haven't got any money. So we had to develop in the School of Art a way of creating engagements that would bring connections with a greater range of students. So as well as having international students coming to RMIT, we also taught offshore and had programs that were running in Singapore, New Zealand, Hong Kong and Vietnam. So as a lecturer, once you become immersed in those sorts of cultures, you start to question the Western-centric culture that we are amid in academia. And you start to realise the complexity of the art that you are dealing with and the complexity of people that you are engaged with. So this artist, Ian Wu, also reflects, he's on the left by the way, and he's talking to an artist, another graduate from RMIT, Andrew Tetzlaff. Ian Wu studied traditional Asian art at Hanyang Academy in Singapore. He then went to England and studied his masters at Winchester University, and part of that included studying in Barcelona. He then came to RMIT and did his doctorate. Andy Tetzlaff studied at School of Fine Arts in Boston, then went to Japan and lived there for a number of years. Then came to RMIT, did his masters and eventually his PhD. When you bring those sorts of students together and those sorts of ideas and experiences together, you get a complexity of ideas of what art is concerned with. And so as a result of this, my understanding of Asian art became experiential as well as in books. Ian's work is also shown worldwide in places like Tominaga Gallery in Tokyo, as well as in Singapore and the UK and the US and in Australia. Some of his work will be coming to Australia next year. There's some shows that I'll be curating. You can see the relationship to Western abstraction, but you can also see the relationship to calligraphy and other ideas that operate within his work. There's always been two-way interactions. When we think of the monochrome in Western conditions and the relationship of some Western artists to Asia, Yves Klein comes to mind as one of the early people post-war that started to engage with ideas from Japan in particular. He went to Japan not to study art, but to study judo. And he was a judo expert who eventually came back to France. Also, he was a head coach for the Spanish Olympic judo team, I think, and started to make these works that dealt with the monochrome, but they also included natural materials like sponge. And later on, he explored things that he'd learned out of judo, such as the dynamics of action and performance. So in some of his work, like the famous Leap into the Void work, or some of these other works of empty galleries or works with balloons, they all have connections with the idea of emptiness, the idea of the void, and the idea of nothingness as well. He spoke about the immateriality of work and this sort of semi-mystical condition that was informed both by Western ideas and by Eastern ideas. This is a place in France called Place Renoir, and this used to be in the 19th century an artist's colony. It's also the place that's got a ruin there of a medieval castle that the fleur-de-lis was made. It's a place that British, Swedish artists would come to. Delius was the composer, he lived here. It's about an hour from Paris. And in some ways, these ideas, whether I like it or not, have followed me around the world, because in this little village that contains one boulangerie, one pharmacy, there was this sign, and it translated as the Japanese artist precursor to modern painting in his country. He lived there from 1890 to 1892. Just remember that Japan only opened up to the West in around about 1850, 1845. And by this stage, they'd already started to develop a modernisation, both culturally and industrially. So Kuroda came from a noble family, and he went to France and studied painting. He's exhibited several times in the Salon in Paris, and then returned to Tokyo, where he was one of the lecturers at the newly formed School of Fine Arts in Tokyo. And he worked along with an American artist who helped to develop their curriculum, which was based on a European idea of the academy via an American understanding of it. It was an interesting place because it started about the same time as RMIT in the 1880s. And what Kuroda was able to do was teach the next generation of Japanese artists, which included Fujita, who some of you may know as one of the artists who lived in Montparnasse and was friends with Picasso and the whole Paris school in the 1920s. He was famous for painting cats and nudes and his lifestyle, which is pretty wild. He returned to Japan in the 1930s and started to make militaristic, or paintings that were supporting the militaristic imperial Japanese policies of the time. Needless to say, after the war, he wasn't very popular in the West, but he did return to France where he died. But he also encouraged local Japanese people, including this guy, Yoshijiro, who is the founder of Gutai movement in the 1950s. And Gutai, if you like to think of it as a field where the body and substance collided. It was one of the first movements that was connected post-war with Western avant-garde movements. So often our history tells us about the history of the Western avant-garde is that, you know, Paris was the centre of art before the World War, and then it went to America. And we forget about all the other movements that were ongoing in different parts of the world. And one of the key movements that operated in Europe after the Second World War, again in a ruined environment that was rebuilding, trying to break a new art that was questioning the traditions of art before it, was a movement called Zero. And one of the members of that Zero was this guy Heinz Mack, who did this diagram of a whole range of movements that were happening and related, that varied from movements in Argentina to Yugoslavia to Gutai in Japan. And all of these in some ways had different connections. Null, which means empty, was a very famous exhibition in Holland, and a group of people that worked there, and Gutai was invited into that in the late 1950s, early 60s. Jiro did works like this, or Yoshihara did works like this, which were setting up situations in parks so that there was a type of engagement with non-artists, but also the energy of what mark making could do. Later on he made works like this, which were in the 1970s perhaps connected to American colour field painting, but also connected to this tradition, the tradition of the Enso. And Taido Soto was a Renzai abbot in Kyoto, a Zen priest, and he did this sort of work based on the Enso symbol or Enso sign, which is this circle. It's not the circle that Raphael would draw, which is a perfect geometry. It's about a dynamic energy. And the importance of this is that what does this circle reveal? It reveals both an energy, a mark, and it also frames nothing, but it also sits in nothing. So the idea of the emptiness of this, the emptiness between calligraphy, the emptiness between words, and the emptiness between marks, reinforce this idea of the field of potentiality. So in some ways it's about the empty and full, something and nothing, and it's got a type of expansive resonance, and it's a metaphor of the movement of the mind and of consciousness to some degree. Also involved in Gutai, the second generation Gutai, was this guy Akira Karayama. He belonged to Zero Kai, which is a zero society which had nothing to do with the zero movement in Europe initially. But he joined the Gutai group. And these large-scale works that were originally done horizontally but then transferred vertically. You can see him working on this. Some of them look like this, and again, remember, this is in the 1950s. Think about Jackson Pollock, think about, what similarities and differences are. These are quite large works. This is about, 2 metres by about 3 metres. And it consists of this web of line, this web of energy, this continuum marking. But they're not made by hand. They're made by these little machines that are remote controlled. And in some ways this is very different to abstract expressionism and the gestures that operated within that sort of thing. There was a type of distancing that happened in these sorts of works. You remember the work that we saw, the big pink work is by Atsuko Tanaka. She also was famous for doing these sorts of performances she made this neon dress. And again, it's got to do with colour, movement, and they're incredibly dangerous, I think. It's a wonder she was still alive. But she was married to this guy, and he was one of the few Japanese people that, again, helped support her because she became much more famous as an artist than he did for a while. And he was very supportive to her practice. But again, this sort of embodiment, this sort of energy that is part of these works are quite important. They then get sometimes translated back into pictorial form. So this is some of her work. And again, the dot is not the source or the property of any particular culture. This dot is different to the dot of pointillism, to the dot of indigenous practice, or to the dot of Damien Hirst. They're all different. Back to Saburo and his breaking through these planes of colour in a performative act. And again, I think this can be just like seen as a Dadaist act, or an act of stupidity, but it can also be seen as a metaphor for breaking into freedom, or breaking out of the confines of the frame as an artist and into the performative world of the experience. Kazuo Shiraga, again a large work that he did, which again looks, if we just see it in reproduction, like abstract expressionism. And again, what we have to remember is how are these works made. When we look at them, it's not just about image, but it's about the residue of action. So these works were made by swinging around like a bad British comedy of the 1960s to make art. And he uses his feet. Now, this might look as a contemporary Dadaist action, but it also relates to the gestures that operate within Zen painting and the way that certain Zen priests, created particular dynamics and gestures of thrown brush technique in painting. We go back to a connection with Klein. These were paintings that were supported outside with balloons in air around about 1964, leading up to the Tokyo Olympic Games. It's also, you see that these works exist in the void as well as being about the void. Colour sensation is one of the key things that operate when we look at monochrome works. Colour has got energy, and this idea of energy is really important, and it's a global, universal experience. However, colour meaning and symbolism is local, it's culturally specific. So one of my students, again, Chen Xiaopeng, who lives in Taiwan, we used to have these discussions about what colour people drew the sun when they were children. And most people in the West will draw the sun yellow or an orangey yellow. most people in Northeast Asia will draw the sun red or an orangey red. In this work, which is just called Universal Sign, it's her having a bit of a go, I think, probably at me, but also this has got a pear, which is a very similarly painted object, but it's called button. And so there's a sense of humour that operates in her work. Again, just to bore you, this is one of my works in the Heidi. No, this is not in the Heidi collection. There's a similar one in the NGV, I think. When I just read this briefly, it's called When Two Directions Become All Directions, and it's a play of positive and negative, where the surface again becomes atmosphere. It's about 2.5 metres high and 180 wide. So it's an immersive type of painting. I'll just read this briefly. On emptiness and the monochrome, my work has often been mistakenly described as minimalist. I use simplicity or emptiness as a strategy for presenting things as they are. The apparent emptiness, or the monochrome or interval, is a tool for decentering the viewer psychically. The monochrome is what it is, and also acts as a key to seeing and understanding the world around it. How is the world different? The paintings return us to acknowledge the instability of perception and fact. Emptiness, blankness, or transience need not be viewed as a lack or negative. It is part of a process rather than a thing, a relational state of becoming. So hopefully I've drummed that into you enough tonight. One very brief thing that we'll talk about that again has got an implication for some of the work we'll look at is this idea of embodiment. Not simply the object in isolation, but the movement of the artist and the viewer, and meaning amid time, and the complexity of the natural amid badland works. And in this work that I'll show you, there's also this idea of respect. This is a drawing I made when I was in Japan. It's called Lessons from Kamakura. And Kamakura has got this giant Buddha, and it's very famous, and it's an incredibly beautiful presence. Its original structure that had disappeared years ago in either an earthquake or a flood or something. But again, it's a traditional icon of Zen and of Buddhism. You can also go inside this Buddha, which I think is an even better metaphor for the Buddha. It's about emptiness, and it's also got where his head is, it's totally empty and dark, a bit like an Enso sign. It's beautifully fabricated. When you leave this very large Buddha, close by is this small shrine, almost an altarpiece. And when you look at it, it's got this aperture. To see in that aperture, you've got to bend over. And inside that aperture is a sculpture, a realist sculpture of one of the abbots, along with coins and things like that. But in order to see that, you have to bend over, and in Japan, that bending is a sign of respect. So whether you like it or not, you are showing respect to this person, or personage. So this idea of painting, installation, or pictorialising time and space was important. And this idea of how things could unfold in time became of interest to me in my practice. And so in works like this in London, which was called Taking a Monochrome for a Walk, it was a performance, but it was also documented as a photograph that's now in the NGV. And this photograph does two things. One, it's a physical object as a photograph, and so the whiteness of it is nothing. The monochrome is just white photographic paper. But as an image, the whiteness actually is a key for seeing the various whites and greys around you. It sets up a contrast, it sets up a relationship. Other works of mine, this is called Contemplating the Silence of Colours, was part of an installation called what was it called, at RMIT, called Colouring Impermanence. And this work was at an exhibition, Love Poem to Life at Heidi, where again the colour led you through to a monochrome in front of a window that blocked the view of the garden outside, and you could only see the trees and other things, the green things beyond it. It was using a principle that operates in Asian practice called the borrowed landscape. This work is called Phase Mother Earth of 1968 by Seki Nilba. It deals with full and empty, positive and negative form. It's part of a sculptural exhibition at Kobe's Sumo Rikoyo Park. It consists of an 8.5 foot tall cylinder of earth standing next to an identically sized hole in the ground, a powerful iteration of pure form and material that deteriorates over time. And that deterioration over time is critical content. It's part of a Monoha movement, and the Monoha basically means the school of things. One of the leaders of that was Li Yufan, and this is him standing in front of his museum on Naoshima Island in Japan. Li Yufan was originally Korean. He lives both in Japan and for a long time he lived half the year in France. He's one of the few people I know that's got 3 museums to his name. One in Japan on Naoshima, one in Busan in Korea, and one in Arles in France. One of the things that I think is important is that this guy was a theorist who helped popularise Monoha in Japan, again in the 70s, at a time when there were student unrest in Japan and in Korea. There was a dictatorship in Korea. There were a whole range of things going on. But he moved to Japan to look after his uncle, but he attended Nihon University in Tokyo and studied philosophy. And the people that he studied with were Nishida and Nishitani, who were the school of Kyoto. And in the 1930s, they had strong discussions with Heidegger, trying to reconcile phenomenology with Zen. So again, even though these are contemporary practices, and Li Yufan is very well schooled in Western philosophy and theory, he also is well schooled in the traditions of the East. He also is a great wine collector, apparently. This is one of his works called Relatum, and I'll read this very briefly. In Li Yufan's work, European phenomenology meets Northeast Asian Zen. Forgive my gross simplification here, but it sounds good. He uses minimal form and monochromes very differently from the reductive impulse evident in Western formalism and minimalism. His paintings and his sculpture offer the viewer an encounter between the natural world of materiality with being and infinity. He emphasises the reality, the suchness of things. His art is not a representation, but a process or a manifestation where the nature of change is apprehended through the relationships in time and space and the viewer. He does not manipulate things, but presents them in his work as phenomena, brushstrokes, matter, as relationships between objects in the world and the viewer. He is presenting things as they are, the doing of not doing. The contingency of the world itself emerges in his work. We are amid a process of becoming, again, conscious to nature and the things of the world. So if you think of these as structures of time, you've got the geological time, you've got glass and metal, and you've got an action that has created this shattering. So you've got a whole range of these things that come together that are for our contemplation of being. I won't sort of go on too much with that, but this is some of his paintings. and it's a series called From Lines in 1974. And again, you'll notice that these lines are about action, and the lines move from fullness of the brush to becoming invisible, or to infinity, in a sense, to materiality. This is one of his work, a show of his work called, that includes works called From Point to works from Line again. It's a beautiful work of his in the NGV. He was also associated much later with the Dansei-kwa movement, or the Korean monochrome movement. And again, one of the early influences on the monochrome movement in Korea was this artist, Kim Won-ki. He did this work in New York in 1971, but he was educated in Japan in the days of occupation in the 1930s and 40s, where he studied in Japan. And Japan was the vehicle for into Korea for a type of westernization and modernization, both of the education system and also as well as the militaristic occupation. But when we look at this work, you can see its connections with Western modernist painting of the 70s. But it's also got something quite different. It's got this poem, and it's inspired by this poem, by his friend, who's called Kim Won-suk. Among a multitude of stars, one stares down at me. Among a multitude of people, I stare up at that one star. As the night grows deeper, it fades into brightness, and I disappear into darkness. Where and in what form will the two of us, you, one so warm, and me, one so tender, meet again? Now this is a very beautiful poem, but it also is in a tradition of Chinese poetry and Korean poetry. And there's a whole range of different metaphors in it, but it's also to do with a type of sentimentality that you would never get in Western painting in New York at that time. There's a type of poetic romanticism that we would see. One of the leaders of the Dansei-kwa movement, and Dansei-kwa only became a movement after a while. It brought a whole lot of these ideas of monochrome painting together, and even politically became quite important for the current Korean government to promote the history of contemporary modernisation in Korea. These are called the Écriture series, and again, not just influenced by French theory, but Park Se-bo was looking at his son drawing and trying to write Korean within a grid, which is the way they learn, and realised that his son was not being able to do that and was going all over the place. So he made this body of work based on these rhythms that of writing on this whitish field of colour. And these monochromes again deal with the ideas of matter and nothing, of full and empty space. Or one thing I should say, the colour white was interpreted very strongly, particularly by Japanese. They associated that with the colour of Koreans because white was a colour of clothing that was often used in Korea. But it was also a colour of mourning in Japan. And so the Japanese theorists often would speak about Dansei-kwa movement and the Korean painters as the people of sorrow. This is by Jung Hyun-kyun. Again, a painting that is stained, again done in the 1970s and 80s, and is still working today. These look again like colour field paintings, but the materiality is different. They're using traditional Asian materials and on a very open weave type of hessian, and the colours bleed. But again, this has got two colours which reflect, two titles which reflect very much the nature of complexity when we look at these works. The umber and blue are the facts that make this colour black. when they're mixed together. But it's also called Gateway to Heaven and Earth series. So again, there's this metaphor all the time about the relationship between the mind, the spirit, and the material reality. I won't look at this very much, but in the 1980s, are you surviving, by the way, you guys? Nearly asleep? We're just about finished. In the 1980s, there was the dictatorship in Korea, and the abstraction was seen as a protest in a way, because it was regarded as paintings about silence. So they were no longer paintings about propaganda that the government wanted people to be making. And again, at this time, the Americans supported the dictatorship. And in the 1980s, there were a lot of protests about this in a different way. And there was also a reaction to the Dansei-kwa movement by artists. And I don't know if you know about the Gwangju Biennale, but it was set up to honour the democracy movement and the killing of protesters during the demonstration against the dictatorship. You can see there's a list, there's a particular colour spectrum that Koreans use, but in reaction to the Dansei-kwa movement of very cool, often white paintings, there was this Minhwa movement, which basically just means folk art, and it was a type of expressionism. One of our friends, my friend Su Yong-song, was a prime example of this sort of movement, where he did large-scale paintings that appeared initially to be expressionist paintings, but they have a very strong Korean centered content. This is one of his many studios. He's got about 3 studios this size, and he's one of the leading artists in this movement in Korea. This is part of his history painting, based on the stories within the Joseon dynasty, which was one of the longest running dynasties in Korean art. Finally, we'll look at the Teshima Art Museum. The structures of these were built on domes of earth, and concrete was poured across them. It's a contemplation on grey, on the full, and on empty. The inside of them look like this. And again, it's a beautiful contemplation on fullness and emptiness of something and nothing. And the cord that you can see hanging down in the middle is a silk cord. That's part of the work by Naoto. The architect is called Nishizawa. And again, you'll see there are pools of water, and this water comes from, it's pushed up through pipes into on this very beautifully finished concrete that makes it run like mercury, and it runs into these drain holes and makes this sonic element. So that what you're left with is a type of space for contemplation. Again, all those things about emptiness and fullness, about being amid nature. Grey, as a colour, as we all know, is mixed by using all the other colours. And in Japan, there's a very interesting use of concrete. And the concrete often has got this lightness and this luminosity because of what's put into it. It's very different from the way concrete's used in industrial countries, or in Brazil, or in the industrial, probably the closest type of use of concrete's in Switzerland, where things are finished in a very particular way. So I'll finish with the Yufan. Thank you.